For over 200 years, Grenada was at the heart of the transatlantic slave trade, a colony of Britain and France. In the wake of the racial reckoning in the US, across the Caribbean there are growing calls for the colonial powers to pay reparations for slavery. Members of the royal family touring Jamaica were met with demands for Britain's government to apologise for its role in the slave trade. My family in England owned slaves here on Grenada, and though we never set foot on the island, we profited from the sale of sugar. And when slavery was finally abolished, we got compensation from the British government. The slaves got nothing. Now Grenada is debating the idea of reparations for slavery and what that means. I've come here to confront the past and to ask how it shapes the future. I felt apprehensive as we began exploring Grenada, not knowing what I'd discover or how my quest to unearth the past would be received.
One of the things that the British government asked for was for the planters to say how many slaves they owned and to make a record of how many were born, how many died each year. So Grenada actually has some of the best records.
Nicole Philip Dow is my guide. She's a historian, an official at the University of the West Indies, and vice chair of Grenada's National Reparations Commission on Slavery. We begin our journey by looking at University College London's database of slave ownership in the British Caribbean. So, should we see what happens if I type in my name?
Let's have a go with it.
All right. It's gonna... Trevelyan. Okay, and then let's put Grenada. Let's see what it's gonna come up with. Good heavens. We have Reverend George Trevelyan, Harriet Trevelyan, John Trevelyan. So this is showing us that my ancestors owned what looks like hundreds of slaves on Grenada, on the Tempe estate, the Simon estate, the
Rucan estate,
Lassages, five different
estates, yes.
My relatives owned hundreds of slaves and received thousands of pounds in compensation when slavery was abolished in 1834.
Yes. The sort of diseases that would have been around.
Once we knew the names of the plantations where my ancestors owned slaves, Nicole showed me the records from those very estates.
That's the deaths again. This one is actually the Boucherjou estate, and this record is 1817.
So that's when my family owned slaves on Boucherjou?
On Boucherjou estate. So it says these are the annual increase and decrease of the slaves on the Boucherjou estate in the parish of St. George. And then it goes on to show by death how many died.
Look how many slaves died.
And this one is interesting. This is Alexander. He's only 1 year old. He's black. Creole, meaning that he would have been born in the Caribbean. He dies of obstruction of the bowels.
So a 1 year old?
A 1 year old, yeah.
This is the Boucherjou estate, high in the hills of Grenada, once a sugarcane plantation jointly owned by the Trevelyans. The production of sugarcane fueled the transatlantic slave trade, and it's here that slaves owned by my family worked long hours harvesting the crop.
This is the location where the slave master would come out and look over the slave plantation, the sugar plantation.
At Boucherjou, I met the second of my guides, the historical novelist D.C. Campbell, who grew up on Grenada. D.C. explained what life was like for the slaves shipped here from West Africa by the colonial powers to harvest the valuable sugarcane.
To the left, we would have seen the windmill turning, and those would have the big rollers that would crush the sugar canes. Very dangerous work, because the rollers, when you're feeding the rollers with the sugar cane, if your fingertip gets caught, it's the beginning because your finger pulls your hand, and then your hand, your shoulder, and then your entire body. And there are cases of entire bodies being crushed in those machines. There's just not enough time to stop it. So the solution at that time was to have a big machete standing close by, and someone whose job it was to keep an eye on the feeders and the machete. And the minute someone got stuck in those rollers, they would take that machete and chop off the limb.
Good Lord.
Yes. They'd rather lose the arm than a life, because that human being with one arm can still get back to doing the work that lost them their arm to begin with. So it was very brutal, not just what they were inflicted on with punishment, the work itself was punishment.
It would be an instrument of control.
These were the instruments of torture used by plantation officials on behalf of slave-owning families like mine.
So these are shackles, and these would have been used on children. So little hands are expected to fit in here, and they would be sort of bound like this.
It's making me feel physically sick, the way that you describe that. It's like a system of profit built off torture.
Yes.
Now, would you say that the system worked for those who were the recipients of the wealth?
Yes, it worked. It did. It worked for those who received the wealth.
The BBC's producer, Koralie Barrau, was watching all this. As a descendant of slaves on the Caribbean island of Haiti, this trip is intense for her.
Seeing the brutality, the artifacts of slavery, the whips, the chains, in history class you learn about it, but I've never seen any of this. It hits hard, to think that could have been me 5-6 generations back. It really, really hits home.
Today we want to chat about the legacy of slavery.
That's a feeling shared by these schoolgirls who are learning about the legacy of slavery from Nicole Phillip Dow, who's on Grenada's Reparations Commission.
So, this is Laura Trevelyan. Now, one of the things about Laura is that she found that her
5 times great-grandfather.
5 times great-grandfather was a slave owner.
Here.
In Grenada.
And then, when slavery was abolished, in 1834, my family received the equivalent of £3 million in compensation. And the slaves received nothing. Do you think that my family should pay money in reparations to the people of Grenada?
After class, I sat down with the students to find out more about their views on reparations and the legacy of slavery on Grenada.
There's a lot of racism and especially colorism. Even though a majority of Grenada is black, there is still a lot of racism and colorism. And I think these things pass down from the minds of parents who have taught their children these things. And so there's a lot of psychological damage that has been done.
Just steps away from the market where the freed slaves were once sold is another prompt from the past. The name Hanky is well known on Grenada, and my family owned slaves on this island in partnership with a Mr. Hanky. He was our agent. Freed slaves often took the names of their masters, so it's possible that my relatives owned the ancestors of the Mr. Hanky who runs the store today. It's so nice to meet you.
It took a bit of persuasion before Mr. Hanky would speak to me. It's disconcerting when a complete stranger turns up to ask about the past.
If it was the case that we were linked by history, what would you think of that?
That's deep. That's deep.
Do you think it's fair that my family got money when slavery was abolished, but the slaves here in Grenada got nothing?
No, not at all. It wasn't fair. I believe that the slaves were the hard workers. They are the ones that should really get some form of compensation.
So Mr. Hanky and I may be connected by Grenada's history of slavery over thousands of miles and hundreds of years. Britain's influence can be seen throughout the island. Streets are named for slave-owning English governors. They'll be renamed for prominent Grenadians. Britain's government has never apologised for slavery. The Foreign Office told this programme slavery was and still is abhorrent, expressing deep regret that the slave trade could ever have happened. That's not enough, says Ali Gill, head of the island's Reparations Commission.
The British government, first of all, must apologise wholeheartedly with regards to the role that it played in the slave trade and slavery. And not just the British government. We cannot live out the monarchy. Yes, we cannot live out the Queen of England. The Queen of England and the royal family played a critical role in sanctioning and participating in the slave trade and slavery.
The pressure on colonial powers to invest in the Caribbean islands they extracted so much wealth from is only increasing. Coming here has forced me to directly confront the brutality of slavery and reflect on how I might respond. There's no erasing the past, but by debating reparations and asking for the pain of slavery to be acknowledged, Grenadians are reclaiming their history. Laura Trevelyan, BBC News, Grenada.